when my mother looked me dead in the eyes at the reading of her will and said, "You're worthless, just like your father." I thought that was the worst moment of my life. I was wrong. 3 days later, I learned the truth, that my father had been worth more than my mother ever knew, and he let her destroy his reputation just to protect her pride. My name is Dalton Reeves. I'm 42 years old, and I restore broken furniture in a small shop in Queens that barely pays the rent. My mother, Francine Reeves, died with $38 million to her name. She built a real estate empire by stepping on anyone who stood in her way, including my father. My twin sisters, Bianca and Porsche, got everything. Every property, every piece of jewelry, every dollar from her empire. And me, I got an old briefcase. A cracked leather case that had been sitting in a hall closet for 20 years. It once belonged to my father, Nathaniel Reeves, the man my mother called the biggest mistake of my life. Every Christmas dinner, until the day she died, my sisters laughed when the lawyer handed it to me. Portia even took a photo for Instagram. "When Mom's will is more savage than her business deals," she wrote in the caption, while Bianca offered to buy me lunch because I'd clearly need a free meal now. The briefcase looked worthless. Dusty, rusty clasps. The kind of thing you'd throw away without a second thought. Inside were just a few old drafting tools, some furniture sketches, and a single business card for a bank in Manhattan. I almost tossed it in the trash. Almost, but something made me dial the number on that card. And when I did, the voice on the other end said something that made my blood run cold. "Mr. Reeves, we've been waiting 20 years for this call. Your father's account has just unlocked." They asked me to come immediately, and to bring the briefcase. 3 hours later, I walked into a vault beneath Manhattan, not knowing that my entire life was about to change, not knowing that everything I believed about my father was a lie. When they showed me what he'd hidden all these years, when they told me the amount in that account, I dropped my phone. It shattered against the marble floor. But I didn't care, because in that moment, I understood why my father smiled in every photograph. Even the ones taken after my mother publicly humiliated him. Even the ones after she told everyone he was a failed carpenter who couldn't support his family. My father wasn't a failure. He was a man who loved my mother enough to let her believe she'd built her empire alone. And that briefcase she'd left me, that final insult, was actually the key to an inheritance that made her $38 million look like pocket change. But it wasn't the money that shocked me the most. It was the letter. The one my mother had left at the same bank, dated the day before she died, proving she knew exactly what she was doing when she handed me that worthless briefcase. Before all this, before my world turned upside down, I lived a simple life in Queens. My apartment sat above my shop on Steinway Street. 5 rooms that always smelled like wood stain and lemon oil. Every morning, I'd wake up at 6, make coffee in the same chipped mug my father gave me for my 18th birthday, and head downstairs to work. There was something honest about taking broken things and making them whole again. My father taught me that. He died 20 years ago when I was just 22. Young, naive, still believing family meant something. The shop wasn't fancy. Dalton's Restoration, painted in plain black letters on a handmade sign. But inside, every tool had its place. Every piece of wood was sorted by grain and age. People drove from Connecticut just to have me work on their antiques, not because I advertised, but because word spreads when you do something right. I charged fair prices, paid my bills, kept my head down. It wasn't the life my mother wanted for me, but it was mine. Francine Reeves, my mother, was a storm in human form. A deal-maker, a force of nature, a woman who could turn concrete into gold with a single phone call. 71 years old and still closing million-dollar deals from her hospital bed the week before she died. She built Reeves Properties Limited. From the ground up. At least, that's what she told everyone. She had her favorite story. How she married young, had 3 children, then discovered her husband was allergic to ambition. How she saved the family from bankruptcy while he wasted his life building furniture no one wanted. She told it at every dinner party while my sisters nodded along. Diamond bracelets glittering, smiles sharp as knives, Bianca and Porsche were exactly what my mother wanted her daughters to be. Ambitious, ruthless, polished, both Yale graduates, both married to investment bankers, both living in Manhattan penthouses where the monthly maintenance fee cost more than I made in 6 months. At family dinners, they'd talk about market volatility and portfolio diversification while I sat there, sawdust still in my hair, hands rough with calluses. Dalton, the craftsman, Portia would tease like it was an insult. I'd smile and say, someone has to keep the tradition alive. And that's when my mother's jaw would tighten, like she'd bitten into something sour. The truth, I lived the way I did, partly to honor my father, and partly to spite her. Nathaniel Reeves was a quiet man, patient, deliberate, the kind of man who could spend hours sanding one chair leg until it was perfect. He never shouted, never argued. Even when my mother screamed about his failures, he just kept working. He used to tell me, "The grain tells a story if you're patient enough to read it." He died in a hospital bed while my mother was at a property closing. His last words to me were, "The truth has been waiting for you to be ready." I never understood what he meant, until I opened that briefcase. The day my mother died, I was refinishing a Victorian writing desk. My Uncle Roderick called, said she'd had a heart attack in her office. By the time I reached the hospital, she was gone. Bianca and Portia were already there, on their phones with lawyers and accountants, always one step ahead, even in grief. The funeral was a spectacle, a who's who of New York real estate. Everyone had a story about Francine Reeves, the queen of the deal, the woman who never backed down. At the reception, Uncle Roderick pulled me aside. He was my father's only brother, a quiet man like Dad. He sipped his whiskey and said, "Your mother never forgave your father for something." I frowned. "For what?" He shook his head. "Never said. But, Dalton, your dad wasn't who she made him out to be. Remember that when the will is read, I thought he was drunk. I thought he was just trying to comfort me. The son everyone pitied. But when he gripped my shoulder, his eyes were clear. 'Your father was the smartest man I ever knew,' he said. 'He just loved your mother more than he loved being right.'" Those words haunted me, and then came the will. The law office of Jacobson and Associates. Sat high above Manhattan. Glass walls, marble floors, leather chairs that smelled like power and old money. I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing my father's old watch and the only decent suit I owned. My sisters were already there, seated like queens, their husbands beside them like Armani-clad bodyguards. "Dalton, you came," Bianca said with a smile that wasn't really a smile. "The lawyer, Mr. Jacobson, read through the formalities, the estate's value, the divisions, the trusts." Every sentence was a dagger. To Bianca and Portia, the properties, the stocks, the jewelry, the art collection, and to me, the briefcase. The room went quiet. Then Portia snorted, "Well, at least you got something made of leather." Laughter. Flash of an iPhone camera. The click of a pen signing documents worth more than I'd ever see in a lifetime. And me, holding that briefcase, the weight of my father's ghost in my hands. When I left the office, the city lights blurred through the rain. I walked for hours, the briefcase clutched like a secret I didn't understand. Back at my apartment, I pried it open. Inside, the sketches, the tools, the card. Manhattan Trust and Investment Private Division. Something told me to call. The number still worked. A woman answered. Calm, professional. "Manhattan Trust, how may I assist you?" I hesitated. My name's Dalton Reeves. I found a business card belonging to my father, Nathaniel Reeves." There was a pause. Then her tone shifted. "Mr. Reeves, we've been waiting for this call." I froze. "Waiting?" "Yes. According to our records, your father instructed us to release certain materials upon verification of his heir's identity. The account has just unlocked." My pulse quickened. "What account?" "Sir," she said softly, "we can only discuss that in person. Please bring the briefcase." 3 hours later, I was standing in a private vault beneath Midtown Manhattan, surrounded by silence and marble and the faint hum of wealth. A man in a gray suit led me to a steel door. My name, D. Reeves, was etched on a brass plate. Inside the box was a stack of documents, a sealed envelope, and a key card marked with my father's initials. The banker explained in a measured voice, "Your father established several trusts under different names. The value of the primary account alone currently exceeds—" He paused, looked at me, then whispered the number. I felt the room tilt. Millions. No, hundreds of millions. Money that could have rewritten our family's entire story. I dropped my phone. It shattered on the floor, but I didn't care, because suddenly my father's quiet life made sense. The smiles, the calm, the patience. He wasn't poor. He was protecting something, protecting us, and when I opened the envelope, the truth hit me harder than the fortune ever could. A letter. Handwritten. Dated 20 years ago. "Dalton, if you're reading this, it means you've finally seen the truth. I gave up my name to protect the woman I loved, even when she forgot how to love me back. The fortune you found isn't mine alone. It's the foundation she built her empire on. I let her take the credit because pride was the only thing keeping her alive. One day, you'll understand that sometimes silence is the loudest kind of love." But there was something else. A second letter, dated the day before my mother died. Her handwriting. Sharp, precise. "Dalton, if you've come this far, then you've learned what your father kept from me all those years. I always knew. I just couldn't admit it. I built everything on his sacrifice and called it mine. The briefcase was my apology. The only way I could give back what I once took. You were always his son, not mine. And that's why this was meant for you." I sat there for hours. The son she called worthless. The father she called a failure. And in the end, they had both been playing the same game of pride and love and secrets. When I walked out of that vault, I wasn't the same man who'd walked in. The city looked different. The noise, the light, the people. I understood now why my father smiled in those old photos. Because he knew. He knew that one day the truth would find me, in a cracked briefcase, covered in dust, waiting for the right moment. And maybe, just maybe, my mother knew it too, because power can build an empire. But love builds a legacy that never dies. And as I locked the vault behind me, I realized something else. The briefcase wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning of mine. Somewhere in that vault was a clue, a name, a key to something even bigger, something my father had hidden long before I was born. And whatever it was waiting for me. When the lawyer called my name at the reading of my mother's will, I already knew it wouldn't end well, but I never imagined it would end like that. We were sitting in that glass-walled conference room 40 stories above Manhattan, surrounded by the hum of air conditioning and the faint clink of expensive pens. My sisters, Bianca and Portia, were arguing about what to do with Mom's properties in Connecticut. "Bradley knows a developer who could triple their value," Bianca said, her voice smooth, controlled, already thinking in profits. Portia didn't even bother looking up from her phone. "The Westchester estate alone is worth $12 million, she said flatly. Can you imagine $12 million just sitting there? I stayed quiet, because honestly, what was I supposed to say? Mr. Jacobson entered exactly at 10. He'd been my mother's lawyer for 30 years, through every acquisition, every lawsuit, every ruthless victory. The man looked like someone had asked him to perform an execution. He set down a thick leather folder, adjusted his glasses, and said, "Let's begin." The first 10 minutes were predictable. Charitable donations to the universities that had once rejected my father's applications. I noticed the irony. My sisters didn't. Then came the part everyone was waiting for. To my daughters, Bianca and Portia, Jacobson read, I leave my entire estate, all properties, accounts and investments, to be divided equally. This includes Reeves Properties Limited, all holdings domestic and international, and all personal effects save one. Bianca and Porsche exchanged that little look, the silent kind of victory people only share when they know they've won. Portia's husband was already texting someone, probably bragging about the windfall. Bianca reached across the table and patted my hand like she was comforting a stray dog. "Oh, Dalton," she said softly, her words dipped in poison and pity. "We'll make sure you're okay. Maybe you can restore some furniture for our houses. You do such quaint work." Then Jacobson cleared his throat. His tone changed. "To my son, Dalton, I leave your father's briefcase from the hall closet. It has been in my possession for 20 years, untouched as he left it." Silence. The kind that presses down on your chest. Then Portia laughed. A short, sharp sound like shattering glass. A briefcase. She left him Dad's old briefcase? She turned to her husband. 20 years in that closet and Mom saved it just to make a point. Classic Francine, Jacobson wasn't finished. His voice trembled slightly as he continued. "May you finally understand that choosing his path leads nowhere. You're worthless just like Nathaniel was. The briefcase is to be given to Dalton immediately, as the last lesson I can teach about the consequences of wasted potential." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that never dies. Even my sisters looked uncomfortable now. Bianca's hand, still resting on mine, gave an awkward squeeze. "At least it's genuine leather," she said weakly. "You could restore it, maybe sell it for a few hundred." Mr. Jacobson stepped out, then returned with the briefcase. Old brown leather, cracked and dry. Brass corners green with oxidation. The handle frayed where time had bitten through. It looked like something you'd find in a thrift shop for $20. A relic from a man my mother spent half her life pretending didn't exist. Handed it to me with an expression I couldn't quite place. Pity, maybe, or quiet dread. "There are papers to sign," he told my sisters. "Dalton, you're free to go." I stood, holding that briefcase like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The valet in the parking garage stared as I passed. A man in a cheap suit carrying his entire inheritance in one hand while his sisters stayed upstairs dividing. $38 million. "Need help carrying that, sir?" he asked politely. I almost laughed. The absurdity was too perfect. Back in my workshop, I set the briefcase on my workbench. The room smelled like sawdust and lemon oil. My father's scent, my world. For an hour, I just stared at it. That was her final move. Her last insult. Even in death, she found a way to remind me that I'd chosen the wrong path. My father's path. I opened the clasps slowly, expecting nothing. And that's exactly what I found. Inside were my father's drafting tools. The same compass, T-square, and pencils he used to sketch furniture at our kitchen table when I was a kid. Underneath them, a stack of sketches. Tables, chairs, cabinets, designs I recognized, each one a memory pressed into paper. And at the very bottom, tucked into a corner like an afterthought, was a single business card. Holloway Trust and Savings, Manhattan. Established 1894, a phone number printed in raised black ink. No name, no address. Just an old bank logo on cream cardstock that had yellowed with age. I turned it over, hoping for a note, a message, anything. Nothing. For 3 days. That card sat on my kitchen counter next to the coffee maker. Every morning, I stared at it while the coffee brewed. Every morning, I asked myself the same question. Was this another trick? Maybe it was an old account with a few dollars. Maybe it was long closed. Maybe this was part of her cruel joke, sending me on one last wild goose chase to prove that my father really had nothing. But then I'd hear his voice. My father's last words, whispered through the hiss of hospital machines. "The truth has been waiting for you to be ready." He said it with such quiet certainty, a man who knew something he wasn't allowed to say. For 20 years, I'd carried those words like a ghost in my chest, and now that card felt like the key to a locked door. On the third night, I was in my workshop, finishing a Victorian writing desk I'd started before Mom died. The wood grain glowed under the lamp, smooth and perfect after hours of sanding. My father used to say, "Wood never lies, Dalton. It shows every flaw, every strength, every story in its rings." As I wiped on the final coat of oil, I made my decision. Tomorrow, I'd make the call. Thursday morning, 9:00 a.m. The city was already awake, engines rumbling outside my shop, sunlight bouncing off steel and glass. I poured my coffee, stared at the card one last time, and dialed. 2 rings, Holloway Trust, established 1894. How may I direct your call? Her voice was crisp, polite, the kind of tone you'd hear in old movies about men in suits and briefcases. I swallowed. "Hi, I found this card in my father's things." His name was Nathaniel Reeves. Silence. Long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then the voice returned, quieter now. "Please hold." Soft classical music, strings and piano, played for 30 seconds before another voice came on. Older, male, measured. "Am I speaking with Dalton Nathaniel Reeves?" "Yes." "Son of Nathaniel James Reeves, born April 15th, 1960? My pulse quickened. "That's right." "Mr. Reeves," he said. "My name is Charles Aldrich. I'm the president of Holloway Trust. We've been waiting 20 years for this call." For a second, I forgot how to breathe. "Excuse me? Your father's trust has very specific instructions. You need to come to our Manhattan office immediately. Bring the briefcase and identification. Can you be here by noon?" My hand shook as I wrote down the address. "Can you at least tell me what this is about?" "Not over the phone, Mr. Reeves. Your father was very specific. Noon today, if possible. This matter has waited long enough." I closed the shop, showered, put on my only good suit, and took the train to Manhattan. The briefcase sat beside me, heavier than ever. Or maybe it was just the weight of not knowing. When I stepped off the train, the air was sharp and cold. The bank building loomed ahead. Granite pillars, brass doors, the kind of architecture that whispered, "Old money." Even the doormen looked ancient, their uniforms pressed and polished like museum pieces. Inside, the lobby glowed with marble that probably hadn't been quarried in a century. The wood paneling was rich, dark, perfect. The air smelled faintly of oil and thyme. An elevator operator, an actual human operator in 2025, nodded and wordlessly took me to the 7th floor. He didn't ask where I was going. He already knew. The hallway was silent. My footsteps echoed as I approached a single brass plaque that read, "Private Banking." Mr. Aldrich met me himself, a tall man in his 70s with silver hair, polished shoes, and eyes like a ledger. Sharp, exact, unreadable. "You look like him," he said. Same eyes, same jawline. He gestured for me to follow. We walked through a maze of quiet offices until we reached a room that looked more like a law library than a bank. 3 people waited inside, 2 young men in suits and a woman with a stenographer's pad. On the table were documents, seals, fingerprinting equipment, and a small medical case. Aldrich closed the door behind us. "Before we proceed, Mr. Reeves," he said carefully, "we must verify your identity beyond all doubt. Your father's instructions were extremely specific." He nodded to one of the assistants who opened the case. "Blood test for DNA, fingerprints, 3 forms of photo identification." I blinked. "For a bank account?" He met my eyes. "Mr. Reeves, this is not just a bank account." The words hung in the air like a challenge. "Your father established this trust with conditions that may seem excessive," he continued. "But I assure you, once you understand the contents, you'll appreciate his caution." The next hour was surreal. A nurse appeared, efficient and silent, to draw blood. My fingerprints were taken digitally, and again in ink. 3 notaries witnessed every signature. Mr. Aldrich personally checked each step, his eyes flicking from document to document. "Your father," he said quietly, "was one of the most intelligent men I've ever met. He came to us 20 years ago with a very unusual request: to create a trust that could only be accessed by you, only after your mother's passing, and only if you arrived in person, carrying that briefcase." I looked down at it, the cracked leather, the tarnished brass, my mother's final insult, and suddenly, it didn't feel like an insult anymore. It felt like a door I was just about to open. Aldrich leaned forward, sliding a thick envelope across the table. "Mr. Reeves," he said, "your father left something behind for you. What's inside this will change everything you thought you knew about him, about your mother, and about the fortune that built their empire." I hesitated. My hand hovered over the envelope. The air in the room seemed to thicken. The ticking of the clock on the wall felt deafening, because deep down I knew whatever waited inside that envelope wasn't just money. It was truth. And truth has a way of burning everything it touches. I reached for the envelope, and that's when Mr. Aldrich said softly, almost to himself, "Your father told me once, the son will only understand when he's ready. I suppose today is that day." My fingers brushed the seal. Somewhere deep inside, the old clock struck noon, and the past, the one my mother spent her life burying, finally began to stir. Variant. Standard. Title: The Hidden Legacy of Nathaniel Reeves. Itawantu, 85632. There are moments in life when the world just stops, when everything you thought you knew, every truth, every certainty, shatters in a single heartbeat. For Dalton Reeves, that moment came inside a silent underground vault in Manhattan. When he discovered that the father he thought had died, Broke was, in fact, a genius, a man who'd hidden a fortune and a legacy beyond imagination. But let's rewind. It began with a question. Why? Why would a dying man leave a single briefcase to his son? While his daughters inherited millions, Dalton had spent his life believing he was the disappointment. The furniture craftsman who never chased money, never followed the family's corporate empire. His mother made sure of that. Francine Reeves, the ruthless real estate matriarch, left behind an empire worth nearly $40 million. And to Dalton, her only son, she left a cracked leather briefcase. Nothing more. At first it felt like cruelty, a final insult from beyond the grave. But that old briefcase, it was the beginning of everything. Inside were his father's old drafting tools, a compass, a T-square, a few pencils worn down to nubs, and beneath them, a small business card. Holloway Trust and Savings, Manhattan, EST, 1894. No address, no explanation, just a name. 3 days that card sat on his kitchen counter taunting him. Every morning he'd look at it over his cup of coffee, wondering if calling it would just reopen old wounds. But something about it wouldn't let him go, something his father had once said. "The truth has been waiting for you to be ready." So he called. The voice on the other end was calm, old-fashioned. "Holloway Trust, established 1894. How may I direct your call?" When Dalton mentioned his father's name, Nathaniel Reeves, the air seemed to freeze. A pause long enough to make his heart stop. Then a new voice came on the line. Older, collected. "Mr. Reeves, we've been waiting 20 years for this call." By noon, Dalton was on a train to Manhattan. The briefcase sat on his lap like it carried the weight of a lifetime. The bank was something out of another century. Brass doors, marble floors, doormen who looked like they'd been standing there since Roosevelt was president. The elevator had an operator who didn't even ask where he was going. He already knew. When the doors opened, a man was waiting. Silver hair, sharp eyes, a handshake that carried both respect and gravity. "I'm Charles Aldrich," he said. "Your father's trust manager. Please, follow me." They led him through a maze of offices, down a narrow hall, and into a paneled room that smelled faintly of cedar and history. 3 people were waiting. 2 men, 1 woman. And on the table sat fingerprinting equipment, documents, and what looked like medical supplies. Dalton frowned. "What's all this for?" "Verification," Aldrich said simply. "Your father left." "Very specific instructions," a nurse appeared. "A blood test. Fingerprints, both ink and digital. 3 photo IDs. Every step watched, documented, notarized. Dalton couldn't believe it. "Blood tests for a bank account?" Aldrich's reply was quiet. "Mr. Reeves, this is not just a bank account." An hour later, the final verification came through. One of the younger men nodded. "Confirmation complete." Aldrich stood. "Now, Mr. Reeves, let's show you what your father left behind. Please bring the briefcase." He pressed a hidden panel in the wall. A door slid open to reveal an elevator Dalton hadn't even noticed before. Aldrich inserted a key. The button read simply, B3. As they descended, Dalton could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. The deeper they went, the heavier that briefcase seemed to get. When the elevator doors opened, the world felt silent. No alarms, no buzzing lights, just a cold corridor lined with steel doors. At door number 17, Aldrich entered a code and nodded for Dalton to place his hand on a scanner. A soft click echoed, the sound of finality. Inside, the room was lined with safety deposit boxes and aged filing cabinets. Aldrich pulled out a leather portfolio, his hands trembling slightly. "Your father wasn't just a furniture maker," he began. "He was an inventor. He held 17 patents, designs that changed the global hospitality industry." Dalton blinked. "Patents?" "The modular bed frame used in every Hilton. The conference tables that became standard in boardrooms across the country. Even the earthquake-resistant shelving required in California hotels. All his." Aldrich slid a sheet of paper across the table. Patent numbers, registration dates, royalty ledgers stretching back decades. Dalton's eyes locked on a number, so large, so absurd, that for a second he thought he was hallucinating. $347 million, Aldrich said quietly. "That's the trust's current valuation." The phone Dalton had been holding fell from his hand and shattered on the marble floor. He didn't even flinch. "That's impossible," he whispered. "My father died broke. My mother said." Aldrich's expression didn't waver. "Your father was never broke, Mr. Reeves. He was brilliant. And he chose to remain invisible." But Aldrich wasn't done. He opened another file, heavier this time. "Are you familiar with Reeves Properties Limited?" Dalton laughed bitterly. "My mother's company?" "Of course," Aldrich shook his head. "No, your parents' company. Your father owned 40%. Dalton froze. The world tilted. "What?" "Your father was the founding partner. He was the one who identified undervalued properties, designed the renovations, created the assessments. Every major acquisition in the first decade was his work. Your mother was the face, but your father was the architect." File after file came out. Property contracts, renovation plans, designs drawn in his father's unmistakable handwriting. His signature, his initials. The truth, buried under years of silence. Aldrich continued. He never sold his shares, never touched a cent of his dividends. Everything accumulated in the trust. With the company's current valuation, your father's 40% is worth approximately $200 million. Dalton gripped the edge of the table just to stay upright. Aldrich slid a small envelope toward him. "Your father left letters, one for each year he knew he'd miss. This one is marked Open First." Dalton's hands shook as he opened it. His father's handwriting. Neat, steady, timeless. "Dalton, your mother needed to believe she built everything alone. It was the only way she could feel strong after her father told her women couldn't succeed in business. I gave her that gift, my silence, my reputation, everything, because I loved her. She was brilliant and deserved to shine. But I couldn't let her take your inheritance." The world told her story. This trust tells mine. The workshop keys are hidden in the briefcase. Press both brass corners at once. It's still there, waiting. Build something beautiful. Dad. Dalton pressed the corners. A hidden compartment opened with a faint click. Inside, a set of keys and another envelope. His mother's handwriting. Dated one day before she died, Aldrich looked startled. She came here, the day before she passed. She said she needed to leave something. Unfinished, Dalton unfolded the note slowly. I know what you'll find. I know what Nathaniel did. I spent 40 years hating him for loving me enough to let me hate him. The briefcase wasn't an insult. It was the only apology I could manage. Don't forgive me. Just be better than we were. Mom. Dalton sat there, surrounded by silence and ghosts and love he hadn't known still existed. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. He waited 20 years for me to find this. That night he barely slept. By morning, he'd made a decision. He called his sisters. The briefcase had some information about Dad's estate, he said evenly. Meet me at his old workshop tomorrow. Bring your husbands, Portia laughed. What estate? Mom said he died with nothing. Just be there. The workshop was in Long Island City, a ghost of a building that time forgot. Windows covered. Paint peeling. But the moment Dalton unlocked those doors with the keys from the briefcase, he felt it. The air smelled like sawdust and lemon oil, the scent of his childhood. Inside, everything was perfect. Machines covered in tarps. Benches spotless. Tools lined up like soldiers. A note sat on the main table. Maintenance instructions signed by Mr. Aldrich himself. The workshop had been preserved, paid for, month after month, waiting for this day. When his sisters arrived, they looked confused, almost uneasy. But when he rolled open the main door, revealing that vast, sunlit space, Bianca gasped. This isn't possible, she whispered. Mom said she sold this place. Dalton pulled the covers off the walls. One by one, framed patents came into view. Photos of their father with world leaders, CEOs, craftsmen. Nathaniel Reeves shaking hands with the U.S. president, standing beside the CEO of Hilton, measuring a doorway at Buckingham Palace while Prince Philip watched. Dad designed furniture for 12 presidential administrations, Dalton said quietly. Every hotel, every office that mattered, his work. For the first time, his sisters were silent. Mom knew, he continued. She knew everything. Bianca began to cry. Why didn't he fight back? When she humiliated him? When she called him a failure? Dalton smiled sadly. Because he loved her more than he loved being right. He walked to the far corner and pulled 3 white sheets off a row of small chairs. Each was carved from cherry wood, gleaming even after decades. A brass plate on each one bore their names and birth dates. He made these when we were born, Dalton said softly. Mom told him to throw them away. He couldn't, so he kept them here. Portia lifted hers like it was sacred. It's beautiful, she whispered. It's so beautiful. They sat there for hours, 3 siblings rediscovering a man they'd never truly known. Months passed. The workshop came alive again. The Nathaniel Reeves Foundation for Craftsman Education opened its doors. Free training for anyone who wanted to learn the art of building with their hands. Bianca carved. Portia learned the lathe. And Dalton. He taught. At the entrance sat that same leather briefcase sealed behind glass. Beneath it, a plaque read, Sometimes, the smallest inheritance carries the greatest worth. In memory of Nathaniel and Francine Reeves, partners in all things, even in misunderstanding, and every evening, as the lights dimmed and the smell of sawdust lingered in the air, Dalton would glance at the mantel in his office, at the 2 urns sitting side by side. His parents, Francine, fierce and proud, Nathaniel, quiet and patient. They had fought each other in life, but in death, they were finally together. He often wondered if they were watching, seeing what he'd built, what their silence had created. And some nights, when the hum of the machines faded into the dark and the city outside fell quiet, He could almost swear he heard his father's voice, calm, steady, proud, whispering from somewhere beyond. "Build something beautiful, son.